All right, everybody, welcome back to Here for the Truth. I'm Joel Rafidi, got my co-host Gerasimos with me as always. Today, we're joined by Michelle Dixon, who is a long-time listener of the podcast. And she listened to our episode last week or a couple of weeks ago, The Contradiction of Non-Duality, where we kind of dived into some of the paradoxes in these non-dual teachings and especially the more extreme forms. And Michelle sent us an amazing email, firstly appreciating the episode, but also wanting to bring some balance to the conversation about how this philosophy, I guess, can be employed in perhaps a more grounded way. Michelle is an amazing human being and has been on an awesome journey, and we dive into a lot in this episode, including the impact of intergenerational trauma, how trauma is stored and released in the body, the limitations of talk therapy, what is a spiritual awakening and its integration into daily life, what is enlightenment, how do we balance the infinite and finite nature of this experience, spiritual bypassing, and so much more. I think you guys are going to get a lot of value out of this, and really hope you enjoy it. Just a quick note, Rise Above the Herd, the doors are now closed. The next round probably won't be till, I guess, maybe late in the first quarter next year sometime. But we'll let you know for sure. In the meantime, you can head to the Rise Above the Herd website still and join the waitlist to be first notified when that becomes available again. Thanks for listening, and please enjoy.
You are now listening to the Here for the Truth podcast, hosted by Joel Rafidi and Gerasimos.
All right, everyone, welcome back to Here for the Truth. We have Michelle Dixon with us. She is a somatic therapist, writer, and researcher based in Sydney. On her Substack publication, she explores frameworks for soul-centered trauma healing, navigating the line between healing from past wounding and spiritual awakening. In her practice, she works with complex trauma with clients all over the world using an eclectic range of modalities, from the conventional to the shamanic. She also writes fiction. Michelle, welcome to Here for the Truth.
Thanks for having me, guys.
No worries at all. We're good to see you again. We worked together briefly a few years ago, I think with a tarot or astrology reading or something of the sort.
Yeah, or it's a taroscope. I had a look at it before the call actually to remind myself. Yeah, it was really cool.
Amazing. Well, it's nice to see you here, and I love how things kind of come full circle for sure. I guess just to kick this off in usual HFTT fashion, can you give us a bit of your personal hero's journey and I guess some of the major catalyzing transformative moments in your life that have led you down this path?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, actually. So I've been in Australia for 25 years now. So my accent's kind of like mid-Pacific, I guess. I don't know. It sounds American to me, but yes, I grew up in Atlanta and went to college in the States and studied international relations. Don't ask me why. I think I thought I was going to study something like anthropology. I was really good at languages and I wanted to travel the world. And, what do you know when you're 18? But it was way too heavy on politics for me. And I think it was the first kind of like awakening in the Here for the Truth kind of sense for me and that experience, because I started to, I had assignments and I'd go to the library and I'd read like history that wasn't on the news and discovered things, that weren't talked about. And I was like, are you serious? And then got into Noam Chomsky and, that kind of set me up. But I was really interested in human rights and I minored in Russian language and literature. And I was really interested in human rights abuses in the former Soviet states and, what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so because of my interest and I speak Russian, I learned it in college, I decided to go into a PhD into research in the area of human rights. And through a weird kind of series of coincidences, I met, it was actually a job I had after I did my undergraduate degree. I was hired to work as a translator for the day with this man called Mustafa Jumilyev, who's the leader of the Crimean Tatar National Movement. Now, the Crimean Tatars are a Muslim people from Crimea, which is Ukraine. Of course, Russia's taken over Ukraine, so taken over Crimea years ago, before the war. but they were deported during the Second World War by Stalin to Central Asia, and like kind of overnight cattle cars, most of the population was decimated. It was fully a genocide. And during the Soviet era, they advocated for the right to return to their homeland. And they were really unique in that they did it like peacefully, like non-violently. They used, like the peaceful protest methods, I guess you could say. And I was really young and I was paired up with this like internationally renowned like human rights activist that, was kind of like getting awards right, left and center. And I was super intimidated. He was very, very small. He was like even a lot shorter than me, and I'm 5'4". So like, but he had this presence that was like massive. And I knew that he'd gone on the longest hunger strike in the history of the Soviet dissident movement. He spent like 25 years in like prisoner camps in Uzbekistan, and I was super intimidated, but like really fascinated. And I became really interested in this story. And so when I did my graduate work, I decided to study that nationalist movement, and I went and I lived in Ukraine, in Crimea, and I was living kind of in between two settlement camps, which are kind of like refugee camps. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, when these people returned to their homeland, it was the collapse. They weren't given passports. They didn't have the right to work there or live there. They squatted on their own ancestral homeland. And they had nothing, and a lot of them were dying from blood diseases, which I wonder now what had to do with Chernobyl, because it wasn't far. I don't know if the soil was, I don't know, but they were all, many of them were having, like they had blood, like they had leukemia, and there was a lot of illness, and they didn't have access to any kind of medical care. So people were just dying, and I was interviewing them about their political movement, but I was getting all of their personal stories of being refugees and the intergenerational trauma and genocide. And I had absolutely no context for this. Like I was 26 years old, and I'd never studied anything like psychology. I'd done some counseling in high school, but like I only had this instinct to just greet it with presence and compassion. But it seemed to me that that was the real story somehow. So here I was interviewing all these leaders about their politics and their movement and how they created a shadow government. And it was super interesting, but also because I'm female, I would interview all the male leaders, but then every other moment, aside from me interviewing the male leaders, I was off with the women in the kitchen because that was just, the natural place for me to be. So I was hearing all these family stories. And I remember one woman, it was like, she had 3 sons and her husband had died of throat cancer and basically starved to death because there was no treatment, no pain relief. He just couldn't eat. And she was just so, like, she had this strength of character, and I was really affected by it. And I think so that was a real moment of change for me. I really questioned everything. And it just seemed to me that academia was kind of like beside the point. Like, it just seemed like that ivory tower of like, how is this going to help people who are living in that situation? Like, how do people survive this level of trauma? Like, what is it about the human spirit? Like all the questions for me, why? And so when I finished the PhD, I decided not to go into academia, and I decided to have my babies. I have 3 young adult kids at the moment, kidults, and I really wanted to be home with them. I became really annoyed at feminism, not like first wave feminism, like, yeah, I think I should have the right to vote and, own property. But this idea that like I had to be like a man and have a corporate job, like just didn't sit well with me. I really wanted to be with my babies. And so I was for a full time for a number of years. And then I went through a really hectic divorce. And it was kind of like that first adult crisis. So, and during that time, I was writing a lot. I wrote 3 novels that never got published. Like I was just dicked around by publishing. I had literary agents, I had publishers who wanted me, and then they changed their mind at the last minute. And it was like heartbreaking every time. But I kept writing, kept looking after my kids. And then the divorce hit, and I was like ground zero, all of the skeletons came out of the closet, everything I'd managed to not look at in my own personal life. It just came roaring out of me. I was completely out of control for years. And it was just like, abusive relationships, like narcissistic people, all the trauma came up. And during that time, I was retraining to do somatic work. So, because I knew after my experience researching that I really was interested in human suffering, I really wanted to understand like how that happens, and had to start with me. It's like the wounded healer. We all start with ourselves. So I did heaps of study around that. I did shamanic de-armoring, and then I wasn't satisfied with any of the explanations I was getting from my coaches, because it was this, in your estimates, you probably get it. It's this kind of culture, a little bit like, oh, just feel it, like whatever happens, like just be with it, But I was like, I wanted to understand like why, like how does the body hold trauma? This was before, the body keeps the score was like mainstream knowledge. That was about like 15 years ago now. It's like, how does trauma, how does it get stored in the body, and how is it released? Like, what's the mechanism? And so I just did a lot of study around that. I did my facial craniosacral work. I landed in biodynamic cranial touch, which is part of the osteopathic tradition. And it's kind of a non-dual approach to body work. And in every point in my journey, I sort of was like thinking, I'm going to get more knowledge. Like Michelle wants knowledge. I'm going to learn how to do stuff. And then I rock up to a training. It would be like, this training is about just being present, But through that presence, I learned a lot. I think it was really the making of me, because I had to trust my instincts and be with myself. And then I just expanded my training into more talk modalities. I wanted it to be fully comprehensive, And even from body work, was already doing a lot of sexual trauma. That was a lot of what I was seeing, what was presenting, and that just carried on into complex trauma. And I've over the years tried to like move out of it, but that just seems to be the thing that people see me for. And during all that, I had my own spiritual practice, and I was aware that there were things happening on another level. And that's become more clear to me, really, especially in the past 2 years. But yeah, that's kind of like the high level, hero's journey type stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great story. I mean, you were able to explain it very succinctly. I mean, pretty amazing spending all that time, obviously, in Crimea and investigating and interacting with these people that have gone through things that, are very different than maybe many of us have gone through in our lives, for sure.
Well, certainly, like you grow up like I did in this like middle class kind of lifestyle, in America. It's not something I had seen, I had any context for. Like, it was one of those brain breaking moments where you go, oh, like how I live isn't how everyone lives, like that young adult moment of kind of going, wow, like, yeah, we're fake. Yeah.
Real quickly, I mean, I know we'll talk about a bunch of things today, but you had highlighted something about, doing research on the fact that the body stores trauma, and how does it store trauma, and how does it release it? Can you like speak to that? Because there are people that go, there's no proof that the body stores trauma, like, and how was it? Where is it? And so I'm just curious, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know you do this work as well, so you can chime in if you have your own way of understanding it. I've looked at it from a lot of different levels, but the way that I like to explain it to clients is just to really make it simple so people understand. It's the sense in which you have an emotional reaction to an event in your life, and the emotional reaction causes a muscular constriction somewhere in the body, just instinctively. And different emotional reactions have resonance in different parts of the body. Like there's that study with that graph that shows people like from all different parts of the world, doesn't matter their race, ethnicity, religion, culture they grew up in, people tend to experience, grief in the chest or love in the heart or, et cetera. Or when they go into fear, that contraction of your gut. And these are just responses that are probably humans have had for forever, right? But when there is an emotional impact, we do tend to clench the body. And if that impact is not, it's not released, it's not worked, it's not processed, if you don't come into that nervous system regulation, that contraction causes what then people refer to as armoring. So it's a contraction that's just there. And that's the best way that I know to describe it to people so that they really understand why, if I'm touching like a particular part of the body and there's pain and discomfort, and then there's emotion, and then there's memory, like why is that happening there? Can often trace it back to, or these things happen. And I was constantly in this sense of like contraction.
Yeah.
But also, like, there's other research around it, I think, in terms of like the most recent thing is, well, it's not recent. I think in 2017, research came out that the interstitium is a thing, and the interstitium being these little sacks of like liquid in the fascia. So the fascia is like this fascia, if people don't know, it's this like layer of muscle. We call it muscle, or a top layer tissue that covers your whole body. That's I liken it to like if you have a hanger in the closet and you have a dress on it, like the dress is like the fascia that covers your whole body. And so if you were to scrunch up, the dress, it would affect how that dress falls everywhere, and that's the same thing with the fascia. If you have contraction, it affects everywhere. But with the discovery around the interstitium is that, there are these little, like these little pockets of liquid, and they get trapped and isolated from other liquid parts in the fascia because of the contraction, because of the emotional reaction, the trauma. And then there's this sense in which there's this cellular material, which is trauma, which is held in that. And what's interesting about that is that even before this officially came out, this is a thing. It's amazing. There's this liquid material in the body. When I was learning biodynamic cranial touch, the whole premise of that modality is that when you do this non-dual, like contact with someone, and they soften and they relax, the body becomes first liquid, and then it becomes more of an air kind of medium. So we were learning that the body has this liquid capacity, and that if you're present with someone with this contact, there'll be this increased flow, which is healing, And the idea is actually that those little isolated pockets in the interstitium would start to open up, and then there'd be a flow, and the flow is the healing and that releasing of trauma. But is that your experience too, your osmosis? Like, how would you describe it?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's probably more like neuroscientific ways of talking about it as well. It's not really my MO. I mean, I tend to go from the experiential lens, which, just receiving and giving so much body work. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, in the sense like you're working on someone, you're engaging with them, you're walking on them, or doing whatever kind of work in a place where the person maybe feels safe working with you, and like emotions and shaking and all this stuff comes through. Like, that's the proof. Like, for me, that's the proof. Yeah. Like, if you're just walking around, okay, maybe something could come up, but someone's viscerally like touching you and working with you, and then you're like in fetal position, weeping and heaving with snot coming out of your nose. Like, I mean, it seems like something's being released and moved in the body.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. And I mean, like, I think these explanations are really great for clients, so that some people more than others really want to understand why. They're really thirsting. And so I do my best. But as you say, like, the experience is the main thing. Like, if you come in pain and something's released, and then eventually and you feel better and you recognize that catharsis, like, isn't that speaking for itself? And by the way, I think that is one of the revolutions we're seeing in the healing space, is this prioritizing of experience over, needing to explain and categorize. And that's come from, I think that's come from the psychedelic resurgence of psychedelic kind of treatment models, is that we're going, hey, hang on, there's an experiential dimension and it matters. Like, people's experience, we can't quantify it, we can't map it. People are having these experiences and they're creating change. And at some point, I think, this is something I'm really curious about as well, but I think that it all comes from psychedelics, this idea that we're finally starting to really take seriously the experience of things without needing proof. And that shades into the awakening experience, Kundalini experience, because that's also something that we might not be able to prove with science, and yet it is happening. So thank God we're starting to take this more seriously.
Well, yeah, and even just bringing more of a focus on the body and sensation. Some of my training is based on Peter Levine's work, somatic experiencing. Literally somatic experiencing in the body, and having and building an awareness of sensation and what is happening. Sure, we can talk about things all the time. I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm anxious. Okay, well, what's going on inside of you? Where is it? What do you notice? And then 2 minutes later, well, what are you noticing now? Like, do we bring that level of self-awareness to a deeper level, or is it just we're just sitting there like talking heads, just talking about stuff? And I've worked with tons of clients where they have this experience, and like sometimes some people have more somatic awareness where they're like, okay, I'm feeling a little sweaty in my right armpit, and then I feel tingling sensation. And then some people are just like, I don't know, I kind of feel the same, and it's just again, it's different for certain people, but like, how do we build more sensitivity to that? Which I think it's nice to know that people are moving beyond just talk therapy, and I say just, there's obviously benefits to it, but it's not the whole picture. And especially when you're dealing with pre-verbal trauma and things that were happening pre-language.
Oh, totally. And a lot of treatments really do those people a huge disservice. I've been to a rehab facility, and I've done some training in that. And I walked away feeling like really a little bit like I was shocked and upset in a way, because I could see that the whole model was built on, we need to talk about what went wrong. What about all those people, as you say, who had pre-verbal trauma? They had abandonment as infants. They don't have memory. How can they talk about it? Then they kind of end up being pathologized and not understood and not served by these models. So and
it further perpetuates the, like, even in the individual, like, well, nothing's going to help me. Nothing can help me. I've tried that. And it's like, well, there are things that are evolving, and there's new developments, new understandings of the body, of neuroscience, of what's really happening. And so I am happy that people are becoming a little bit more integrated in that regards. Real quickly, just because you said it earlier, and I want to get some clarification. What is non-dual contact? Like, like to me, I almost feel like that's like, I'm confused, because you contact, like one person touching the other. And so what's non-dual about that? Yeah, please.
What's non-dual about the modality is that you're supposed to be centered in your own, what they say, midline. So like this midline of your body centered in, and actually Judith Blackstone, I always confuse it. He does the realization process, has a similar thing of, there's this inner kind of midline part of you, but you're supposed to be centered in that as your kind of like your soul or your wholeness. And you're making contact with the person physically, like you are touching them, but you're in a space of wholeness. I think it's just semantics, really. It's just, I'm referring to it as non-dual. There isn't like anything specifically about that that's like non-dual, but the practice is non-dual in that you're not engaging with the person's like individuality or personhood. You're not doing anything, directive. You're just being in your own wholeness and letting your wholeness make contact with their wholeness, and healing kind of happens through that space.
And that's something that you've seen results with regularly, or?
That's a great question. You're like, how does this work? It takes a really specific kind of client who enjoys that. I use it more as a way to end a bodywork session where I do a holding point and I go into meditation. But really, I'd say, okay, maybe 10% of how I use it is at the end of the session, and 90% is in my own inner disposition. So what I really got out of that training is this ability to drop in deep in my own center and not have projections or opinions or ways I think that the session has to go, and just being deeply attuned. It's that thing of therapeutic presence. So like I did over 7 years, like lots of training, and it was always like being at a Vipassana retreat, really. Like you spend 5 days a week for hours a day, just in a really meditative state. And what you notice from the training is you start to have like really big shifts of consciousness, and it changes your relationship to yourself, to everything. I've had completely depersonalized experiences where I feel like I'm actually everyone in the room. Like I recognize that, not just like an idea, but this like body felt experience of, wow, far out, I am actually everyone in this room, And what that does over time, like that practice is, it just gives you that grounding and that centering. So when I'm with a client, whether we're talking or doing body work, I'm able to drop into my core and just be more my soul and less Michelle with her life and her opinions and all of that. But the actual practice is just simple contacts, but with this disposition. It's kind of hard. Yeah.
I mean, I personally see how that can be beneficial, coming from a, I guess, detached, less judgmental place, being centered within oneself. And very often some people just need that to feel that presence or that mirror. So yeah, I'm not discounting that in its entirety.
Some people really like it. Like if I'm, it just depends on, like, as Erasmus was saying, like how much is a person kind of in touch with their own somatic dimension of experience. Like if they're not, and if they're the person where if you said to them, like, where do you feel the sadness? And they're like, yeah, well, I don't know. What do you mean? Like that kind of person isn't going to like this because they want to have stuff done to them. They're going to be like, what are you doing? Like, I need to have like a process. Like what is this holding my, putting your hand on my stomach for 30 minutes? Like, what the hell is that? Right. But for other people, like if that contact, they feel like tremendous amount, like it's crazy. Like I could sit there and in myself and they'll be like, wow. And then I felt this, and then I had this memory, and it's like far out, it can be really reassuring. So it's one of those things, like I feel into it, like with the client, and it's usually, as I say, something I do at the very end, just kind of like, to almost like, I don't know, conclude the session in a lovely, nurturing way.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Yeah. All right. So I guess a week or two ago, we recorded an episode called The Contradiction of Non-Duality, where we kind of addressed some of the extremism and dogma around the non-dual philosophy and ideologies. And you sent us a lengthy, awesome email, on that topic, which we both really appreciated. So I'd love to dive into your perspective on, I guess, how one, can come to appreciate a philosophy of non-duality and still, remain grounded in terms of understanding trauma and somatics, and the nuances of everyday reality, which some of the extreme versions tend to ignore.
Yeah, that's a really big question.
Answer all of it now. Yeah. Every single aspect.
No pressure. Where do I even begin?
Well, I guess how do
you define non-duality, like you? Because non-duality has come from different traditions, and it's maybe and is viewed maybe differently. So I'm curious, like, what is your view of it, what it isn't or what it is, and
what are the ways in which, like, it's beneficial and applicable to you in everyday life, I guess, as well?
Yeah, I guess I'll just riff on it, right? Because like it's such a huge topic. Like you can come at it from so many different angles. I mean, it's a tradition that exists, in many religions of the world over time and space, this idea of a shared reality, that we are all part of the same fabric of reality. So I'll start there. And we can we can go to science and physics and say, okay, everything is like, when you break it down, we're all just atoms floating around in space, blah, blah, blah. There is an aspect of our reality which is shared, which is unified. Like we are obviously all part of the same fabric of reality. And in a spiritual context, that's taken into this domain of, enlightenment, which is that at some point in your evolution, you will like be less of your individual atomized identity with all of your complexes or whatever, and you'll come into a more of a embodied realization that actually we're all one. How that happens specifically really depends so much on the specific tradition and the culture in which it's embedded, and that's a point I really want to make as well, is that, if we're talking about, let's talk about realization for a moment. Like, what is this idea of like spiritual awakening? There's so much out there, in like the public space around it. There's a lot of, everyone's saying, oh, like we're having this mass awakening, 5D, whatever. And I resisted that for a long time because, well, just generally, like as a personality, if everyone's talking about it, I question it. Like,
yeah, me too.
I'm just like, like, how do you know? What does that mean? But I think what I'll say about realization or awakening is this the sense in which you realize that you're not just a human, that there's an aspect of you which is eternal, which is consciousness, which wasn't born and will never die, which exists before the body, during and after. And, you know, the realization or the awakening is around somehow integrating that experience into your life, you know, and there's so many different gradations of that. There are different ways, like different stages, like there's so much there, but just as a general kind of definition, I will say that's how I understand it. It's just this experience of understanding that. And with spiritual realization, you know, I think we can all agree that there are a million different ways. If we call that the mountain, there are a million different paths up to the top of the mountain, right? Like, and there isn't a right or a wrong way. Like, it's the destination that matters. The journey can be different for everyone. And, you know, the non-duality is, you know, one of those ways, and it's different permutations. Like, you know, like there's the different traditions, Buddhism, Advaita, and everything. But those traditions, that non-duality, they have come from a time and a place and a culture and a history. And so certain paths make sense in certain cultural, historical contexts and not in others. And I think the danger and what we're seeing is taking that experience from a specific path, like this kind of like no self path, where it originated probably in what's currently India, and plonking it in the West, where we have a culture of individuality and individuation. And that's not how we understand, you know, the evolution of the human being. So the danger is taking something that was meant to happen in a particular context and trying to universalize and apply it to everyone in the present. So how I think it relates to me is, in my work, in my life, is just this sense of, I am always both. I am always Michelle, and I'm very much an ego, and I'm an individual, and I live my life. And, you know, my mission is to be authentic, to be the best Michelle I can be in my lifetime. And also, I'm aware that there's a part of me that transcends that. And having those two parts of me come into coherence, where they're, like, let's say, working together, supporting each other, is my goal and my mission. And that's kind of how I work with clients as well, if the conversation's on the table, which it isn't always. Like, you know, I'm not going to force it if it's not already there. Maybe you can ask me a question now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I guess I'm curious too. You can share your personal experience, but just in general, like the non-dual state, like, what's the felt experience from your standpoint versus, I feel like many people can get caught up in like the intellectual, conceptual understanding and use that as a way of bypassing other aspects of being human.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is the danger you're speaking to, is the danger of kind of over prioritizing phenomenology. Phenomenology being shit that happens, right? Like altered states of consciousness, like somehow equating an altered state of consciousness with a particular kind of evolution. Like, you're so advanced because like you had this non-dual experience. I mean, you can have, I've had, like I shared with you earlier, like in one of my bodywork courses, I definitely had the experience of, I felt like I was everyone in the room and they were me, you know, that lasted, you know, maybe an hour. It passed. It was a consciousness state, much as you would have if you know, were to, you know, do some kind of psychedelics, right? That is an experience that's not, and some people who are, you know, like non-dualists they believe that state is what they want to be in all the time, but that's just a consciousness state. That's not what it is to be human. That's not the ultimate reality that we're all aiming for. It's just a shifted state of consciousness. And so for me, I've had these experiences, but the way that I feel like, I guess maybe what you're asking is like, what is the integrated, like day-to-day experience? And that is just having an awareness all the time of being both. And it can be uncomfortable because you're infinite and you're finite.
Isn't that? I align with you. I everything you're saying. That's how I live my life. I agree. There's a part of me that's Joel that lives everyday life, and I have a deeper knowing and understanding that there's a part of me that's infinite and eternal. But isn't that a duality in itself? The infinite and the finite.
Of course it is. Yeah, of course it is a duality, and I think this is what I call like a levels confusion, right? And this is one of the biggest problems I have with like the pop culture version of non-duality is that yeah, you know, at a level everything is one, but that's not the level my consciousness is focused on at the moment. Like if you think of a radio dial, the dial is dialed into I'm Michelle living my life, you know, and all the other frequencies are there and the atmosphere, but I'm not dialed into them. Yeah.
I think it's becoming more of a semantics issue, because how does anyone know that there's only a level where everything is always one and nothing else? But the moment that something else is there, you know, it's no longer non-duality. So I don't know if it's just a language issue or what, but is there ever a place in existence where every single person is just the everything, the one, and there's nothing else? But the moment there's nothing else, for me, it's like, how can we use this language of non-duality?
I think it isn't like, I think what you're pointing to, I mean, this is really interesting. Like as you're speaking, I'm realizing, okay, like part of the problem is that I don't think that our brains are naturally wired to experience the oneness of everything. Like our brains are wired to, you know, I don't know how, I think Brendan Murphy, what did he say in his interview? Like I don't know, like the brain is like
a receiver,
right? Like, yes, everything is connected and we're all atoms. And when people have consciousness, when they have that phenomenology experience, when they have a consciousness shift, you know, it's like, I think Ken Wilber calls it like the state change versus the stage change. You can have a state change, but that doesn't mean that you've changed the stage of your evolutionary development from, you know, enlightened from non-enlightened to enlightened. It's just you know, that. And I feel like does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying there. You know, I mean, again, I think it, like Joel said, it comes down to some semantics.
Your personal philosophy, I agree with and align with. I think it's just a description of it. And then people take this descriptor and they kind of use it to negate reality and to negate the kind of everyday aspects. And they try to think that, this infinite space is the real space, and this experience is the not real space. And so there's less value and less care and less attention that's given to this space that now in their minds they think is not real, you know? And what bothers me is when we negate the finite, when we negate what's happening now, because this certainly feels like the most tangible part of my experience.
Of course. And it is. And that's why I say it's a levels confusion. Like we are living at this level of reality. And so this is our reality. This is real. This is our mission. This is what we're here for. Sure, there are other dimensions and levels that exist or coexist, but that's not the mission. That's not why we're here. That's not the experience. And I mean, for me, it's bypassing, but it's also a trauma response. You know, I think that this way of looking at it is really comfortable for people who don't want to be in their bodies because they don't want to deal with the trauma that's there. They don't want to deal with their own patterning and their own conditioning. They're not happy with their egos. They're not happy with, you know, the ways that they have reactivity, for example. So it's easy to abstract to the higher level of reality. Is it there? Absolutely, it's there. I had the experience. It's there, but that's not how to live a happy and integrated life. And I don't think that any non-dual tradition is actually advocating. You know, I think that's a misinterpretation of the intent behind it, which is that, you know, as a human spiritual person, you are starting to release layers of your conditioning, which is what in every tradition Enlightenment is about, right? You're releasing and stopping identifying with these layers of conditioning to realize the realization that you are the infinite experience of you. And in all of these traditions, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, Sufism, there is a descent. There is a sense in which you realize that there's this interconnection, and then you descend into the body to live as your most authentic self. And this is the part that I think doesn't get talked about. And Again, that's why I think it's the trauma response, because this is so important. Anyone who has genuinely had a realization will say there's this sense of opening, followed by this sense that now that I've kind of like let go of some of my conditioning, I can be the most authentic version of myself. I mean, even Adyashanti, who's probably America's one of his most famous Buddhist teachers, when he describes his awakening, it was like there's an ascent and a realization at this level of consciousness, followed by this sense that I'm fully back in my body and living in an authentic way that I haven't experienced before. And that has also been my experience with my, I hate to call it awakening processes. I feel like the term is so hackneyed. It's like kind of like uncomfortable for me, but whatever it was, we'll just call it that. Like for me, that was my experience. I had at a certain point, and there's like a whole long story, which is too much, but I had a certain point, an experience of a dropping in my body, which for me, if I were to try to understand it, and this is why I think, as Erasmus was saying, we have to look at the experience and prioritize that, because I don't know that there's ever going to be a explanation science behind it. But my experience is like something dropping into my body, which I want to say is like my soul, my essential nature. Not that it wasn't there, but it was like it had more space because I'd done some work and it had more space. And then it was like I woke up and reality was really different for me. I have felt more permission to be myself, more myself than I've ever been. The choices I made seemed to be more in alignment. I realized how previous choices had been, had come from wounding, come from, messages from out there. But with this shift, suddenly I was like, wow, like more Michelle than I've ever been, more authentic.
I mean, I definitely agree with that. I mean, my personal experience, sure, early on, my personal development process was much more maybe psycho-spiritual, but when I really got into the physical body and deep body work, like it brought me to a different place of understanding who I was and even how I perceived my environment and how I took in how I responded to stimuli. Like everything kind of shifted and changed for me. And I actually think that doing this kind of work, let's say trauma work, body work, etc., releasing stuck and stored emotions, that allows me to connect more to this so-called non-dual state or this place of interconnectedness. Absolutely. So that's why I think sometimes where some people will go, well, you don't need to do any of that. You just need to realize the truth, the supreme truth of you're not a separate person, that you are infinite, eternal, and we're all one. And maybe people have those experiences, like, you brought up Ken Wilber before. I know Ken Wilber talks about like his, approach to, or his framework, like waking up, cleaning up, growing up, and showing up. And I think Mark Gover talked about that in our first podcast with him. And it's like, sure, like you could just be kind of a normal person doing your thing. And then maybe you do a meditation or you're on the top of the mountain and you have this experience of like dissolving into the oneness. Cool. Yeah. And some people get addicted to that, or they think that's the thing. You go.
Can I just chime in quickly? Like the reason that through trauma work, body work, somatic work, I feel that you feel more connected to the infinite ultimately is because you're more balanced between the poles. Right? We become more centered within our own being. So it's even through a dualistic process itself of coming to greater balance within ourselves that we're connected to this greater soul, infinite space, Yeah.
I think the languaging does get in the way. Like the more that I think about it, we not dualism, like what are the two? Like we as humans, we have a subject-object experience, and that's the duality, right? We have I'm here and you're there, and like we're in a dynamic. And yes, what you're saying, Erasmus, about like people get addicted to the states. Absolutely, and that's the dark side of spending all your time going to more and more ayahuasca ceremonies or doing all other kinds of stuff. Like you can get it is very enticing, right? To be in a state where you feel connected to everything in love is wonderful. But that's not why you're incarnated in a body in this lifetime, and it's not ultimately what non-dualism is about. But I think I mentioned in my email.
But the problem is that people have the experiences, then they think they're God, then they say, this is all you have to do, right? As opposed to coming back to reality and then sharing the whole integrated experience, after the fact.
And that is how you have gurus who are who are manipulative and toxic and really, really, really hurt very vulnerable people who have their own trauma backgrounds, who are looking for, a paternalistic, often figure to give them truth, to help them, come back into, it's almost like come back into consciousness is almost a metaphor for coming back into the womb of mother, where you're surrounded and held and loved, And there is that impulse in a lot of people. And that's not my story, but there are gurus who have a real kind of talent for going into those altered states, and even a real capacity for transmission. And this is where it gets really, really like odd. I know people who have gone or been part of like cults, or they followed gurus who are able to, with one touch, send them into a non-dual state, send them into a state where they have the experience of being one with everything and held in love, and like the light is, and it's just, amazing for them. And so naturally they go, wow, this person can do this for me. They must be like God, and I'm in the right place, and this is my mission. But the thing is that even those gurus who could do that, that doesn't mean that they've sorted their shit out. Their house might not be in order. And that's why in the email I mentioned this great biography of Jumpo Rishi Dennis Kelly, who was a Buddhist teacher in the States. And the guy who wrote the biography, I'm so bad with names sometimes, guys, but he's the guy who has the podcast Buddha at the Gas Pump. It's a really great biography. Jumpo Rishi Dennis Kelly. Anyway, he was he was a kind of a drug dealer really in the 70s. He like managed this massive ring out of California, and mostly psychedelics, and was on the run from the law. But he had a really intense trauma background, but he also had this really weird capacity for transmission. He could go into altered states. He could transmit that to other people. And this is really a thing. Some people, it's just like some people.
I wonder how much of the experience has to do with the other person's desperation to be saved and to be taken to this, touched, and then,
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element of that for sure. There's definitely an element of that they're more susceptible or more open to it. But I also think aside from that, there is enough information out there to show that some people they do just have this ability. But, and I think their path in life is coming into moral alignment with it. Like if I were to, play God for a moment and go like, what is the karmic contract here? It would be like, okay, you're going to be born with these amazing capabilities to really be a good spiritual teacher, but the temptation is going to be power, and how are you going to manage that? And unfortunately, often it's not managed well, and they haven't done their growing up work. And with this guy I'm speaking about, Jimpo, he had a realization when he suddenly looked around him. He was a spiritual teacher. He had all these followers, and he'd had this extramarital affair with someone who was a student, and he ended up in kind of like a 12-step program. And here he is going to this 12-step program, and everyone's going like, I'm overcoming this addiction. And he's like, oh, I'm a Buddhist teacher and a spiritual teacher, and I need to sort this shit out. Like I'm behaving in a way that's working me. And he realized like, I haven't done that trauma work. I haven't done that integration work, whatever you want to call it. Depends on the tradition, right? Integration, whatever. And once he did that, he was really a changed person, and he really introduced that into a lot of the Buddhist communities in the States, this idea that you need to do your spiritual work alongside the trauma work. And I think that's the direction we're moving in. And not everyone's on the same train, but I think that is the direction we're moving in.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And I'd be so curious, people talk about all these masters and enlightened masters from the past. Like, were they? Like how do we know? Because they sat at the top of a hill, and they wore the dresses, and they were intelligent, and wore the outfits. They were intelligent, and they were able to bestow some knowledge on them. But like, we don't know what's going on in their body and their physiology and behind closed doors. And so like, I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of propping people up and not realizing you're still human. Like you're still human there's certain laws, I think, to being human on Earth that you have to navigate and deal with.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, real quickly, the people of recent history they prop up. Like, why would it have changed,
Yeah, I agree. Like I've shared this in a podcast before. I had one of my mentors who, was into parts work. He was a psychologist, a Jungian analyst. And I remember I was in a workshop with him and I asked him, like, what do you think enlightenment is? And his answer was the ability to navigate between opposites, the dance, like to be able to stand between the tension of opposites, this duality that is kind of inherent in the human psyche. The human psyche is a compensatory mechanism. We over-identify with certain ways of being, and other ways of being get lost or pushed down into the subconscious. And so how can we, again, we talk about wholeness, like I think beyond just dissolving into the non-dual state, this idea of like understanding the complexity of being human and being able to embrace, more of who we are in a sense. So I mean, I like that explanation as well, because it feels more tangible and real to me than just, okay, I'm in a non-dual state. Okay, well then how am I going to get up, put my fucking clothes on, go to work, like handle my day-to-day stuff?
Well, you're not. You're not. If you look at accounts of people who go into these expanded consciousness states, I just call them expanded consciousness states. They're not able to function. They'll say, "Oh, I was just walking around days, and I was just amazed because it was everything else." And my friend had to pull me out of the road because I was like walking in traffic, kind of thing. Like it's. Yeah, I like that definition of being able to navigate opposites. And I think ultimately that's the truth. And I probably have said it in a different way, but I think that's my experience as well, is just constantly understanding that I am both. There is a ground of my being, which is incidentally grounded in my being. And if I go into that midline, I can sense that there is an allness there. There is an everything there, but it's it's part of my experience of walking this path as Michelle, basically. And I do think there have been, and I've read enough accounts over the years to say, they're not firsthand, like I can't prove anything, but when you've read enough accounts to say there are some masters who are kind of next level, and the experience of the person, of the kind of devotee, interacting with them is such that there's a deep knowing that person, that the enlightened person is kind of like other, in a capital O other way, like something we maybe don't understand or can't categorize. But I honestly think those people are few and far between, and maybe they're none alive right now. Maybe we won't, find them, but I think that's possible. I think there's enough on record to show it's possible. But I think for the most part, if you're human, you're imperfect. And even when you've healed a lot and done work, you still are a fucking human, and like I have spiritual teachers I work with, and they've had realizations and expansions of consciousness that I haven't attained. And, but they say, like I get angry. I'm a human. Like there's conflict. There's, all these human experiences. I don't think that we ever fully outgrow them, but that's also my approach to, trauma. Like we can do a lot of healing, but, there's probably always going to be, like with parts work and, internal family systems, there might always be that wounded part of you. It might not be kind of like taking over the bus of your life and wreaking havoc anymore, but there are probably going to be moments where, you're aware of it. You're like, oh, like that's my, that's my child there, and I think that spiritual teachers are no different.
I think when people buy into the positive projection field of like this person is enlightened and they don't acknowledge their humanness, that's where I have an issue. Where it's like, I think the people I respect the most are people who have done certain levels of work and maybe feel this connection to something greater, and they're like, yo, I'm fucking human. Like I got patterns that want to knock on the door of my consciousness and take over the wheel. But I say I don't allow it to, or maybe if I do at times, like there's a quick understanding and repair within self or self-awareness, of what's happening. So I don't know. I just feel like running away from being human, like I don't know how a person can be considered enlightened in Earth by running away from the humanness. That's my personal view. You know,
and
being wrong.
That positive projection, Jung had a name for it, right? You call it the golden shadow. Like it's a known psychological thing. And I mean, that definition of enlightenment that you gave is resonant with the ancient esoteric definition of enlightenment, which is much more literal: to be light-footed, right? Which is represented by the fool. And to me, the fool is that archetype that dances between opposites, that has kind of done that work to not get stuck in the psychological minutia for a long period of time. It's able to even move between nervous system states and to come into regulation more often, you know, but to tread lightly in the world was how they saw it.
I don't really like, I mean, the word enlightened is so loaded for me that I think I probably run a mile from it. And, you know, every once in a while I hear some, person say, oh, like I am really enlightened. I think awakened is kind of is kind of better. Maybe that's just a personal like semantic preference. I don't know. But I mean, it's too kind of pie in the sky, enlightened.
Wait, well, both words real quickly. Let me tell you, but both words, like even awakened and enlightened, there's like an end point. It's like, okay, I've awakened. I've enlightened. Like, why can't it just be like an enlightening process or awakening process? Like, it's just like, what's the end point? Okay, now I'm awake. Now I'm enlightened. I got it all figured out. You don't.
Well,
and sometimes it's necessary to endarken. You know, it's necessary to endarken at certain times as well. Like, why are we going in one direction? We need to be moving in both directions.
Well, this is true. And I think I always say deepening into different levels of awakening, because to me, it's a process of ending. And I think inevitable in that process is the going, like a back step, maybe is Joel, you're hinting at. Like, you know, you go forward and then it's like there's another layer of stuff that comes up for you that's, okay, now it's time to navigate this. It's not like just this simple golden path of like joy and lightness. You know, I think there's stability in it. The further you go, there's stability in a sense of inner peace. But I also think you're never going to obviate the experience of being human, and stuff happens. But I think that the kind of people like you're pointing to in this kind of hero worship thing, like I'm really curious about this phenomenon. I mean, I think it's part of human nature, don't you? Like we've always wanted to put people on a pedestal and have that paternalistic kind of like leader who's going to like just take care of us so we don't have to do any of the work ourselves. And you know, and that's out there.
It's regressive. It's regressive. And for most people that I've witnessed, and even within myself at certain periods of my life, when they have these kind of supernal experiences of infinitesimal, they become more susceptible to other gurus as well, because then they're more interested in like, who else is having these experiences? You know, what traditions are these experiences in? Where's the person on the mountain in India that's speaking to me or calling to me? Like they become more susceptible to it. And I think it's through that addictive process that we were talking about previously as well.
Yeah, they get addicted to peak experiences, and they're outsourcing their inner work to someone else. And this is also, you know, kind of the danger of social media, where, you know, people can create platforms and, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And
there's maybe no answer to that, but
you know what the thing is, like, I think what we can all agree on, and what's kind of been fleshed out through this discussion, is that any description of kind of like enlightenment or awakening or whatever, like it requires poles, it requires opposites. You know, it's coming through a place of balance and centeredness and an equilibrium, which even the midline that you spoke about in this non-dual contact, you know. So yeah, I think a big part of the issue is this fucking word.
Well, even if you say enlightened, then in reference to what? So right there you have duality. Awakened in reference to what? Right there you have duality again. So again, I think, anyways, I mean,
you can't have infinite without finite. Like there's no contrast. Everything requires contrast.
Yeah. So there's a semantic problem that people are, we can get over fixated on the word, but even if we put the word away, the idea that we live in a shared reality, I think is absolutely true. But the question is really, well, are you going to do with that information, And what you do with that information about that we all live in a shared reality always comes back to your kind of your like spiritual and emotional relational maturity, like, okay, we live in a shared field. That's obvious. Like physics is saying that that's true. Let's throw out the word non-duality for a moment and just say, yeah, like there is a reality that's shared, that we're all part of everything at a level. And there is a part of us, each of us, that's eternal and just consciousness. Okay. So now what do we do with that information? Like, how do we live with that uncomfortable rub between the finite and the infinite? And to the extent that you're going to go for gurus and thought leaders who are like, yeah, the whole goal is to realize that you're nothing and have no self and there's no such thing as trauma, so why even go looking for it? That directly reflects the own inner work you've done or you haven't done, the spiritual bypassing. And to the extent that you go more in my direction and you look at that honestly and you strive to be the best human self you can be and also integrate that aspect of the divine in you, then that reflects another kind of person. I feel like that's really the problem here is really people who are, that's what it's about. Ultimately, it's people who are willing to own their own journey and path and people who aren't.
Well said, Michelle.
Yeah, I hear you there.
I was going to say something and I lost
it. Oh, sorry.
No.
Well,
no worries. Maybe it'll
see, it's like you can have the awareness, but like the North Star isn't trying to only have that experience. The North Star isn't trying to become a nobody and expel the self, right? You can have the awareness and yet your North Star can be, like you mentioned, becoming the best version of myself, right? Living more purposefully, being more engaged, having more awareness, having more consciousness in my present reality, and still have that awareness as opposed to, oh, I have the awareness and this feels like ecstasy. It's really amazing. So let me try the best I can to make everything else dissolve and just kind of, become that, which isn't psychologically healthy.
No, it's not. But a lot of people aren't healthy. And I think, by the way, if it weren't non-duality we were talking about, it would be something else, because really what it comes back to is how do you integrate in your life this infinite soulful
God.
Yeah, like we could call it anything, but really that's what the issue is like, how do we live from both places, and I was going to try to give an example of that, what that means kind of like in my work. Well, so like in my work, for example, what that means is that if someone, if there, and I never kind of put my views on other people. If someone, I always say like, we invite the soul into the room if you want, but it's like, it's totally up to you. If you want to talk about nervous system, we'll do it that way. Like, but if someone comes in and they have a really metaphysical question, like why was I abused? Like, what is the meaning of it? Like, I believe in my soul, but why the fuck would I choose that for myself? That's like hectic. Why, This is where I think it's really helpful to have a dual understanding of yourself, and not to bring in that word now. I'm going to complicate things, but that's when I think it's helpful to start to look at your life and situation and even your trauma from an expanded point of view, not just as a human, but also from a higher soul level, because it can give someone a sense of solace and meaning. When things are difficult, it's like, it's not just this life and what's happened in this childhood experience has caused all this. Like, there's a larger part of me that's never been harmed by this abuse. It's always been intact. It's always had access to God, consciousness, soul. And that at the level of information, that can help you feel better.
Yeah,
but
and
also,
a more controversial statement, which I brought up with Irene and Mac some time ago, is like, is there a part of me that chose this?
Yes, and that's like, I'm really fascinated by that, and that's something I'm kind of looking into at the moment, because I've even heard a particular woman who was like sex trafficked and like ritual abuse, who had. And often people who have that like really intense, complex like trauma as children, they do a lot of dissociating, and they can go into this really altered state of oneness where they feel like they're surrounded by angels and they can have life reviews. And she specifically remembered like choosing this experience for in order to end the intergenerational trauma and bring awareness to sex trafficking and be part of the solution. And, I don't think if it's not our experience, like, I don't feel comfortable saying, yeah, everyone chooses it, because what an awful thing. I would never want someone to feel that if they haven't made that realization themselves. But I do think that's where this non-duality, and I do think that's where it's helpful in a trauma context. And where I would bring it in is I'm someone, like, I'm always asking more questions and giving answers. Like, I would encourage a client, like what is the question you have? And what kind of questions can you ask to expand that perception of yourself and your pain, to make meaning of it. But also, I want to add that it's not just a mental kind of like shift. I've seen that there's a physiological resonance, recalibration that can happen if someone really gets into a place where they're owning a more transpersonal, like soul-based experience of their suffering. They're like, yeah, okay, there's a part of me that's always whole. And really, like, feeling into that and going into that midline and becoming that, like that realization process, becoming that for a moment can have its own
healing effects.
It can reorganize your nervous system really fast. And that's something I'm researching at the moment. I'm really interested in this more spontaneous healing, where something gets reorganized really quickly because you're working in a different level of consciousness.
Well, even in near-death experiences, there's cases of like people like dying and then kind of coming back, and then their cancer's no longer being present and things having kind of resolved. What's her name? Maria Morjani, I forgot her name.
Morjani, yes.
The most famous one.
Yeah. That's an amazing story. Yeah.
Well, it kind of makes me think too of even just like the power of presence and love to heal. Like, one person could go through something, and you could have two people who, let's say, are practitioners, but then the person doesn't really feel safe with one person, but with the other person, they just feel this presence and connection and love. And so, like, maybe they're able to kind of discharge that stored sympathetic stress that's in their system because of the person that they're with. I mean, so much trauma happens relationally. And so to be able to heal in relation is important. And so for many, that relation may be with this state. Let's say you bring up the non-dual thing. If they feel that connection to this presence, to this ultimate love, like just fucking, that's just like embracing them, then maybe there is the capacity for the release and for the healing to happen on some level. So
I mean, that's where like God heals, or like Jesus. I built a relationship with Jesus and I feel healed. Like, people are having those experiences because, like you're saying, maybe they're building a healthy relationship with something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally, I mean, I've seen that. And as I said, that's something I'm really interested in researching and writing more about. I really would love to explore more case studies of that, because it's definitely a thing. And, of course, it's not a thing you can take and then like reverse engineer and create a modality and go like, oh, like if you do this, like you heal instantly. But, I, like, as you say, Erasmus, it is relational. It is relational. And the studies I've seen that look at like the core, what they call the core factors and what makes any therapy, any modality work or have positive outcomes versus not have positive outcomes, like then the main thing is the quality of that therapeutic alliance, Like, we need other people. And you could say like we need them for, as you say, reparenting. We need to be able to, like look into someone's face and see mirrored back to us like a quality of healing and love that we may not have had at other times in our life. And that can even reorganize your neuronal network, I mean, that's the basis of, that's how children, and babies learn their own self-worth and value, is looking into the face of the mother, the father, those primary caregivers. And through their expressions, they don't have that separation of I'm me and you're you. Like, there's that fusion when they're infants, right? And that is the basis of self-worth. And that's why, like, if someone is saying like, oh, I just feel really empty, like I don't know who I am, I'm depressed, often they didn't get that mirroring as infants.
There's a great quote by the psychologist Carl Rogers. He says, in my early professional years, I was asking the question, how can I treat or cure or change this person? Now I would phrase the question in this way: how can I provide a relationship which this person may use for his own personal growth?
Yeah. Well, I love that. And even just like, I've never even liked the term healer. Like, I'm the healer. I'm the one doing the healing. When it's like, I'm hopefully creating an environment and a relationship where the person heals and the body heals itself. And I was having this conversation with a friend recently, who was challenging some elements around trauma. And he's like, well, is it the modality or is it the presence and the love? And I agree with it to some degree, but I also think obviously there are modalities out there like, body work and stuff where you're actually doing something, but then again, even within that if you're doing the thing, who is the person doing the thing and how is the person relating to that as well? So, I don't think it's as black and white to go, okay, go do this thing and that'll help you. It's like, man, there's so many factors. How, like, the way you and I relate may be different than the way I and someone else relate, and what can come from that relationship.
It's so complex. It's so nuanced. There's so many factors at play, like even what's happening in the person's life that makes them ready to go and see a specific modality, which they really believe in, et cetera, et cetera. Like what's happening astrologically that's leading a person to explore certain things at certain times. Like there's so much that goes into it.
So much. And something I always say to clients is like, you know what? Like healing doesn't just happen in a therapy session. Like life is healing. Your hobbies are healing. Like what are you doing in your spare time? Like what kind of exercise, exposure to nature, nutrition are you putting into your body? Like maybe you've always wanted to knit and, like I hear all kinds of crazy stories like I started painting and I recovered from X, Y, and Z, right? And they never saw a therapist. So I think, it's...
What's coming to mind for me is the common factor in all of that is that the person's relationship to themselves is healing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But with the genuine self, having compassion for self, having acceptance of self, not having a rejection of self and just being this nothingness,
Yeah. And you can find that through anything. And one of the things I'm really fascinated about, and maybe you guys are as well, I don't know, but like I was talking to a friend last night and I was saying like, it's so interesting because like we have this, I see this, there's this divide between like conventional talk therapies that come out of like the psychoanalytic tradition and then pop culture, which is all of these like cowboy modalities that, you do your $10,000 training and there's this quick process and, and people now have so much choice in terms of like what they engage with for their own healing or personal development. And, what is the future like, because like in one world, people don't know anything about like acceptance and commitment therapy or, dialectical behavioral therapy. They're like, what the fuck is that? Because they've done like tapping or, or whatever, and they seem to be two worlds who even often don't communicate with each other. And, I'm just curious about how this is going to evolve over time. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, also too, and I was just having this conversation with my wife earlier. Obviously, this is her area of expertise, even more so than me. And it's like, even do people really understand the things that they're commenting on? Do they really know what nervous system work is? Or they just think, oh, you're doing breath work or you're doing yoga and that's that. It's like, do they have the education of the nuance of the nervous system, of the physiology of the nervous system and what's happening? Can they speak about it? Do they even know what's going on? And I think a lot of people don't. And not even that, even just the definition of trauma, like there are people out there who think trauma is the event. Like that's it. It's the event, as opposed to the very complex psychological and physiological processes that go on in relation to the event. Because you could have an event and two people may have traumatic symptoms and another person might not. There's so many aspects. Even when you get into like German New Medicine and GNM, like, like the conflict shock, like, sure, there can be something that happens, but like, what's happening within you? What's your perception of the event? And then even I've read articles and stories of like, you have people in like war-torn countries that don't exhibit the same levels of, let's say, traumatic symptoms that someone living in New York City in a 5th floor walk-up living alone experiences because someone fucking, dumped them, in a relationship after one date. So, and they're going, and the people in these war-torn countries are experiencing the most horrific things because part of it is like the isolation element. Part of it is, are you connected to a community? There's so many factors that play into why our body may manifest certain things in relationship to events that are happening in our life.
Yeah. And we really lost something in human culture with that loss of small cohesive communities, in our healing journeys, because I think it's not normal to be suffering alone in an apartment in New York, and then your solution is to go pay someone a lot of money and sit with a stranger and tell them,
well, you bring up
think about it.
Yeah. Well, you bring up the art piece before too about painting. Joel and I often talk about the right brain and how is the right brain being fed. And you think of cultures in the past that have dealt with horrific things. They're singing and they're dancing, even though they've just experienced war. Like, what does that do? Do we have that? Do we have those rituals from a community standpoint? But we are very, very isolated in how we live, especially in the modern world, in the urban world, that something that 200 years ago, you'd be like, wait, that's going to cause traumatic symptoms in you? But it does.
Exactly. If there's no healthy factor or healthy entity to relate to, then you're just trapped in your own psychosis, trying to figure things out without having the mirror of, that is the ideal, right? And this is why we all need kind of ideals in our lives. We need healthy role models. We need healthy heroes to look towards, because that is healing in and of itself. It guides the psyche, it guides the soul down a path.
It's that mirror.
Yeah.
We all need a healthy mirror. Yeah. But
like your osmosis is to me.
Aww.
Love you, bro.
Love you.
Right back at you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that no matter what you're doing, whether you're, singing, dancing, painting, seeing a conventional therapist, doing body work, there's space in there to invite, an aspect of the soul, an aspect of like a more eternal part of you, even just as a barometer, like to know that there's a part of you that's never been harmed by whatever is happening, and to have ways to tap into that, whether that is through, you get lost in a flow state because you're drawing and you suddenly tap into that part of you that it's like, wow, like I've gone through this horrendous shit and there's a part of me that's okay. And that's where I think, bringing in, and now I don't even want to call it non-duality after this conversation, but that's where I think bringing in, like your wholeness, your eternal part is really useful. And I think that, in these times, there's an evolutionary process happening, and that has got to be more and more on the table. I think people are wanting that. I feel like there's a movement towards it. Ken Wilber talks about, the different stages of evolution. I think there is something evolutionary. Oh, and the Gene Keys, Richard Rudd is, all about like, this is an evolutionary kind of thing that's happening in our psyche. So I think no matter what it is, however we're healing, bringing that in somehow is only going to enhance the process.
Yeah. And I just want to add one thing, because I agree with what you said. And this idea of this connection to the limitless and eternal nature within us, it can't just be this intellectual understanding. Like it has to be this experiential, true knowing of of like the sensation, the feeling, whatever that is, as opposed to like, I read a book or I saw a post on Facebook and now I believe I'm limitless and eternal. Like there has to be something that's just more deeper.
My personal experience is that has strengthened through me being more engaged with my human life, because there's a deeper recognition of a unique purpose, a unique reason for being, a unique nature to my design, and so by experimenting and delving more into that, by doing so, I feel more connected to the infinitesimal. It's like I'm really pumped up and excited about my life now, and I'm pumped up and excited about my life that will continue, It's not one or the other.
Yeah, totally. And it is in your body, isn't it? Like it is like that thing. It should be in your body.
And thank you to this body that gets to feel that joy and that excitement and that creativity and that passion and these emotions
and the bliss of being in that state.
Yeah, exactly. Like
it's like I know Adyashanti and Bonnie Greenwell is someone I used to read a lot of. She was his student, but she passed away a couple years ago, but she wrote all these books on Kundalini awakenings and so on. And she said, she awakened through bringing her consciousness deep into her heart space. Like a little bit below is this particular spot, like, but she talks about like, if you're having trouble connecting to the infinite, to your soul, drop deeper into your body. And that's the message of my training in this osteopathic tradition as well. Your soul is drop deeper into your body. That's Judith Blackwell's work and the realization process. Drop deeper into your body. That's actually where it is. Whilst you're alive, that is where your connection to the infinite resides. It is really deep in your body. And the more you do the outer work of letting go of, like, the wounding or whatever, the more your body is freed from that conditioning, from that armoring, so that you can feel and sense that infinite part of you. It is in your body. It is the ground of your being. It's not, as you say, this thing out there, and to the extent that you go out there, I would argue it's because it's really uncomfortable being here. And people I know who've been through spiritual awakenings, like really big, deep, profound ones, where they do have a moment of realizing a non-dual consciousness, but then that phenomenon, it recedes, and then they live their lives. But more authentically, what they will say, what they've noticed, and in my experience, is that you have to go deep into your body and do that shedding of wounding, be in that physical process. And it is a torturous physical process. I have clients and two friends now going through this excruciating physical, like physiological symptoms of like this kundalini of like heat, and then coldness, and pains and contraction and memories. And it's all like, and the way that I almost like visualize it is like this bright soul that you are is like desperately trying to squeeze into your form and to fill all parts of your being, your body, with light. But to do that, it has to push out all of the crap, all of the trauma, and people go through enormous physiological suffering, and then they feel landed in their body. So it is a deeply embodied process. Like for me, awakening, experiencing non-duality, it is about being in a body in this world, in this life.
I hear you there. And from a personal experience, before we wrap up, I've found personally, when I've done certain types of work to, let's say, open up my heart more, to de-armor, etc. When I have those moments, let's say I listen to a piece of music or I watch a piece of cinema, and like my heart, like there's this vulnerability that comes up. Like I do feel this deep connection to something beyond. It's not just, oh, I'm sad or something right now. It's something greater that, like, I mean, it that alone is healing. Just being able to truly tap into that state from a somatic, from a sense-based perspective.
I like to call it the mystery. Building sensitivity to the mystery, and I'm very content with it being the mystery. But whatever it is, like, it's there. Yeah.
But it's true, because we don't understand it. I don't think that we have the wiring to understand the infinite and the all that is. We just don't. I think relating to it as a mystery is perfect. Like that's just what it is, and that there's beauty in that. It's
and that's what mysticism is. It's mysticism, right? It's not non-duality. It's be the mystic, relate to the mystery. Yeah. Michelle. Yeah. Love it. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've really, really loved it. I could talk about this topic. I'm sure all of us could, for another hour at least, probably. But thank you for being you. Thank you for, allowing this conversation to foster in the way it has. I think it's going to be really, really beneficial to a number of people, because it is a confusing thing, and I hope that we shed light on it, on some level. How can people connect with you, find you, if someone gets value from this? Let the audience know.
Yeah, well, I think the best way at the moment is like to head to my Substack. You can even Google Michelle Dixon Substack. I do have a website, michelledixon.com, which is my practitioner therapy work. But yeah, like you can join my newsletter for free and just, get my writing, my ruminations on all the things we've talked about. So head there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Everyone else, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Smoking mirrors, I'm seeing through the illusion. Waking up in a time, they think you're in a delusion. Somebody set the alarms, cause they be too busy snoozing. I'm in a DeLorean, fast forward and evolution.